The day my boss laughed at my 12% raise request was the same day he decided I should train the man who would replace me. What he didn't realize was that a few weeks later, he would be staring at a frozen payroll screen, quietly asking the most expensive question of his career: who actually knows how to fix this before continuing? Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if this story touches your heart. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, let's get back to the story. My name is Kelly Bryant, and for 12 years, I ran payroll at Titan Industrial Contractors. The company had more than 3,200 construction workers spread across 5 states every month. The system I maintained moved over $18 million in wages union pay scales, complicated overtime tiers, hazard bonuses for crews working dangerous job sites. If anything went wrong, thousands of people would notice instantly. In 12 years, payroll never failed, not once. So during my annual performance review, I asked for a modest 12% raise. Nothing dramatic, just something that reflected the scale of the system I managed. Derek Halverson, the company's new director of operations, leaned back in his chair and laughed. "Kelly, payroll isn't brain surgery." For a moment I thought he was joking. He wasn't, honestly. He continued, "Your job isn't that hard." Then he slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a training schedule, 2 weeks. My name was listed as the instructor. Below it was another name, Evan Pike, MBA Associate. "Starting Monday," Derek said casually. "You'll train Evan to take over the system. We're modernizing operations." I looked over at Evan. He smiled politely, full of fresh MBA confidence. "Why am I training him?" I asked. Derek shrugged. "Because payroll is simple." The room went quiet. I nodded slowly. "Sure," I said. "I'll train him." The feelings in this story are real. Parts of what follows may include fictional elements and a bit of AI-assisted storytelling to highlight the deeper lessons and emotions. My hope is that something here resonates with you. And if it doesn't, that's perfectly fine. Perhaps it's just a sign to take the evening slow and get some rest. When Derek Halverson said payroll was just numbers in a spreadsheet, I realized something strange. 12 years of work had somehow been reduced to a line item in his efficiency plan. Sitting there in that meeting room, I started remembering everything those 12 years had actually looked like. I remembered the winter morning when 600 workers were about to receive incorrect paychecks because a tax update had corrupted the payroll calculations. Most people never knew about that problem. I stayed in the office until nearly 2 in the morning, rebuilding the logic so the checks would process correctly before sunrise. By the time crews arrived on job sites, everything worked as if nothing had happened. Then there was the overtime system. Titan's crews worked rotating schedules across 5 states, each with slightly different union rules. The old payroll engine couldn't handle it, so I rewrote the overtime calculation framework myself. That change alone saved the company about $2.1 million every year in accounting corrections and compliance adjustments. A few years later, I also caught a quiet tax reporting mistake buried in a quarterly file. If it had gone unnoticed, Titan could have faced penalties close to $7 million. I fixed it before the auditors ever asked questions. Those moments were invisible victories. No celebration, just another payroll cycle that worked. But Derek didn't know any of that. To him, payroll was simply numbers moving across a spreadsheet. During the meeting, he said, "We need efficiency, not legacy systems." The room nodded politely. I understood exactly what he meant. In Derek's language, legacy wasn't about software, it meant me. 2 days later, Derek sent a short email to Human Resources. The message contained only one instruction: start knowledge transfer immediately. When I saw it, I felt the first real bitterness creep into my thoughts. If Derek wanted knowledge transfer, then that was exactly what he would get. So that night, I opened a blank document and began writing a very detailed training plan. The following Monday morning, I began training the man who was supposed to replace me. Strangely, I felt calm, not angry, not bitter, just controlled and focused. the same way I felt during any complicated payroll cycle. If Derek wanted knowledge transfer, I would give him exactly what he asked for. Nothing more, nothing less. Evan Pike arrived at my desk carrying a new laptop and a notebook he probably bought on the way to work. He looked enthusiastic, the way people often do when they believe they're stepping into something simple. Derek stood nearby for the first few minutes, arms crossed, watching like a manager observing a routine handoff. "All right," I said, opening the payroll dashboard. "Let's start with the basics." For the next several hours, I walked Evan through the core steps Derek expected him to learn. I showed him how to initiate a payroll cycle, how to validate employee hours, and how to run the primary payroll processing script. Then we moved to the reporting layer, how to export payroll summaries, generate tax records, and send the standard financial reports to accounting. Evan followed along carefully, typing notes into his laptop. "So once you run this," he said, pointing to the screen, "the system calculates everything automatically, most of it," I replied calmly. After that, I demonstrated how to input manual adjustments when supervisors submitted corrections. Construction payroll rarely arrived perfectly organized. Timesheets changed, union rates shifted. Hazard bonuses appeared unexpectedly when job sites updated safety classifications. The system handled most of those variables, but it still required someone who understood the logic behind it. By mid-afternoon, Evan was beginning to look less confident. "Wait," he said, scrolling through one of the configuration files. "Why does this system have so many manual override options?" I leaned back slightly and gave a small smile. "Because real life is messy." He frowned at the screen. "But if the system is automated, why would we need manual overrides before I could answer?" Derek's voice came from behind us. "Let's not overcomplicate things." He stepped closer and looked over Evan's shoulder. "Payroll systems are supposed to simplify operations," Derek continued. "Automation removes human error." I nodded politely. "Of course." Derek seemed satisfied with that answer and walked away, leaving Evan and me alone again for the next few days. We continued the training exactly the way Derek had requested. I explained how to process weekly payroll runs, how to generate compliance reports, and how to verify overtime totals across different departments. Evan learned how to upload data, trigger calculations, and produce the final reports the finance team expected. On the surface, everything looked straightforward. But as the days passed, I noticed small signs of confusion. Union overtime calculations were the first issue. Titan's crews operated across 5 states, each with slightly different labor agreements. Some overtime started after 8 hours, others began after 40 hours in a week. Certain contracts included double-time clauses on weekends. The system handled all of it, but only if the configuration parameters were correct. Evan stared at one of the rule tables. "There are hundreds of these," he said quietly. 312. I replied. He blinked. "And they all matter. Yes." Another afternoon, he tried running a payroll simulation and accidentally triggered an audit lock that prevented the calculation engine from finishing. "What did I do?" he asked. "You activated a compliance safeguard." I said, "How do I clear it?" carefully. I showed him the reset sequence. Step by step, by the end of the second week, Evan could run the basic payroll process, export reports, and handle routine adjustments. On paper, the training looked successful. Derek even stopped by one afternoon and nodded approvingly at the screen. "See," he said to Evan. "Not that complicated." Evan smiled nervously. I stayed quiet, because by then I had begun to notice something important. Evan could follow instructions. He could repeat steps and execute scripts exactly the way I showed him. But he didn't truly understand the system, not the fragile logic holding everything together, not the hidden exceptions built into the code, not the dozens of small decisions that had kept payroll running smoothly for 12 years. And as I watched him confidently click through the dashboard, I realized something Derek clearly hadn't. Evan wasn't learning how the system actually worked. He was only learning how it behaved when nothing went wrong by the middle of the second week. Something inside me had settled into a quiet confidence. watching Evan follow the steps I showed him. I realized he believed he was learning the system. Derek believed it too. From their perspective, payroll looked clean, orderly, almost simple, a few scripts, a few reports, a few buttons on a dashboard. But what they were seeing was only the visible layer. The real work had always lived somewhere else. Over 12 years. I had quietly built a set of tools that almost no one knew existed. The first were the payroll reconciliation scripts. Titan processed thousands of time entries every week, from construction sites scattered across 5 states. Timekeeping systems were rarely perfect. Data arrived late, supervisors corrected hours after submission, and union classifications changed in the middle of pay cycles. The reconciliation scripts I wrote compared incoming hours with contract rules, payroll totals, and tax thresholds before the final payroll file was released. Without those scripts, small discrepancies could easily grow into hundreds of incorrect paychecks. Next came the audit override tools. Construction payroll operates under heavy compliance scrutiny. If the system detected inconsistencies, duplicate time entries, conflicting overtime rules, or tax mismatches, it would automatically lock the payroll cycle for review. In theory, those locks protected the company. In practice, they could freeze payroll entirely. Over the years, I built override utilities that allowed me to isolate the problem, correct the data, and release the lock without restarting the entire system. It saved hours every payroll cycle. Then there was the manual tax correction system. Titan operated in multiple states, each with slightly different payroll tax requirements, whenever federal or state tax regulations changed. The vendor software rarely updated fast enough. When that happened, I created temporary correction tables that recalculated the deductions until the official update arrived. It was the only way to keep payroll accurate during regulatory gaps. None of these tools appeared in the official documentation. They were written to patch weaknesses in the legacy system, not to advertise how fragile the underlying software really was. As long as everything worked, nobody asked questions. And for 12 years, everything worked. Meanwhile, Derek continued presenting his modernization plan to the leadership team. One afternoon, I walked past the conference room and heard his voice through the glass wall. "We're simplifying payroll operations," he told the board confidently. "The system is more automated than people think." A few executives nodded while reviewing the slides. I paused just long enough to hear one of them ask, "So the transition risk is minimal, very minimal," Derek replied. I kept walking, unable to stop a small smile from forming, because Derek had never seen the reconciliation scripts running quietly in the background. He had never used the override tools that unlocked payroll when the system froze. He had never touched the manual tax correction tables that kept the numbers accurate when regulations shifted. To him, payroll really was just numbers in a spreadsheet. Later that afternoon, Evan was running another training simulation at my desk. He triggered the payroll engine, watched the progress bar move, and looked pleased when the reports appeared. "That wasn't so bad," he said. "No," I replied calmly. "It usually isn't." He closed the program and leaned back in his chair. "So, once I get comfortable with this, the system basically runs itself." Mostly, what I didn't say was that the system ran smoothly because of invisible work no one had ever noticed. Quiet work, careful work, work Derek believed no longer mattered. And as I listened to Evan talk about automation and efficiency, a new thought began forming in my mind. If Derek truly believed payroll was that simple, then maybe it was time to let the system prove him right. The moment that finally broke something inside me happened on an ordinary Wednesday morning. The finance department had gathered for one of Derek Halverson's new efficiency briefings. These meetings had become routine since he arrived, and each one followed the same pattern. Derek presented a slide deck about modernization, automation, and operational streamlining, while the rest of us sat quietly around the conference table, pretending the ideas were new. That morning was no different until Derek decided to use me as an example. Halfway through the meeting, he clicked to the next slide and gestured toward Evan, who was sitting 2 chairs away from me. "Evan will eventually replace Kelly," Derek said casually. The room went silent, not the polite silence people use during presentations, but the heavy kind that follows something unexpectedly awkward. I could feel several people glance in my direction. Though no one said anything, Derek didn't seem to notice the tension at all. "You'll see," he continued confidently, pointing at the screen. "Payroll is actually very simple." For a second, I considered correcting him. I thought about explaining the union differential pay calculations alone could take hours to reconcile during certain pay cycles. I thought about mentioning the overtime exceptions, the compliance triggers, the tax adjustments. Instead, I said nothing. I simply looked at Evan. He shifted slightly in his chair, trying to smile, but the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. Earlier that same week, he had spent nearly 20 minutes trying to understand how union differential pay worked for night shifts on one of our projects in Nevada. He hadn't known that certain contracts required higher hourly rates after a specific number of evening hours. Derek, of course, had no idea that problem even existed. The meeting ended shortly after that. People packed up their laptops quietly and returned to their desks. No one mentioned what Derek had said, but I could feel the uncomfortable sympathy in the room as I walked back to my workstation. 12 years at Titan Industrial Contractors had apparently been summarized into one sentence on a slide. Evan appeared a few minutes later, standing beside my desk with the cautious expression of someone who had just realized he might be standing in the middle of something awkward. "Hey," he said carefully, "about what Derek said in there." "It's fine," I replied calmly. He hesitated before continuing. "Do you think I'll be ready soon?" For a moment, I studied his face. Evan wasn't arrogant, if anything. He seemed nervous. He had walked into a situation Derek had created without fully understanding what it meant. "You'll be ready exactly when Derek thinks you are," I said quietly. Evan frowned slightly, as if he sensed there was more behind that answer than I was saying. The rest of the afternoon passed in the same controlled rhythm that had defined the past 2 weeks. We reviewed payroll reports, practiced running simulations, and walked through more examples of data validation on the surface. Everything looked productive. Inside. Though, something had shifted. The humiliation from that meeting stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because Derek had embarrassed me publicly, although he had, but because it made something painfully clear. In Derek's version of the company, the 12 years I had spent maintaining the payroll system meant nothing. Experience was replaceable. Institutional knowledge was optional. And the system I had spent more than a decade stabilizing was apparently simple enough to hand over after 2 weeks of training. That evening, I stayed in the office longer than usual. The building grew quiet as people finished their work and headed home. I closed the payroll dashboard on my screen and opened a different window instead. My resume? For a long moment. I simply stared at it. The document still listed my original title from 12 years ago. The same role I had slowly expanded into something far more complex than anyone outside payroll ever realized. I began updating it line by line. Senior Payroll Systems Analyst, Multi-State Union Payroll Management, Compliance Automation Design, Operational Payroll Infrastructure. By the time I finished, the sun had already disappeared behind the office towers outside the window. I saved the file and leaned back in my chair. Derek believed payroll was simple. That belief had finally made my next decision simple too. Clarity doesn't arrive like anger. It doesn't explode or shout. It settles quietly. The way a fog lifts from a landscape you've been staring at for years without realizing how little you could actually see. That was exactly what happened to me during the week after Derek's presentation. For 12 years, I had worked at Titan Industrial Contractors. 12 years of payroll cycles, compliance checks, emergency fixes, and late nights making sure thousands of construction workers received the correct paychecks. 12 years of solving problems no one else even noticed. And during those 12 years, my salary had never increased, not once. That realization felt strangely calm rather than painful when I laid the facts out clearly in my mind. The situation was simple. 12 years of loyalty, 0 raises. And now the company's new director had publicly announced that my replacement was already sitting 2 desks away from me. Derek Halverson believed payroll was simple enough to transfer to someone new after 2 weeks of training. So I decided to test another simple idea. What would happen if I stopped assuming Titan was the only place my skills mattered, that night after work? I opened my laptop again and reviewed the resume I had updated earlier. This time, instead of staring at it, I started sending it out. First to 2 companies I had quietly followed for years, then to a recruiter who specialized in financial systems roles. Within 24 hours, my inbox began to fill with replies. The first recruiter scheduled a phone call the next afternoon. She asked detailed questions about my experience managing multi-state payroll compliance and automated reconciliation processes. When I explained how Titan's payroll infrastructure handled thousands of union employees across 5 states, she paused for a moment. "You realize that's extremely specialized experience, right?" she said. I almost laughed. Apparently Derek did not. Over the next few days, I had several more conversations. Recruiters asked about the systems I had designed, the automation scripts I had built, and the compliance procedures I managed. The same responsibilities Derek dismissed as numbers in a spreadsheet suddenly sounded far more valuable when described to people who actually understood payroll operations. By the end of the week, 2 companies had asked me to interview. One of them moved surprisingly fast. Their finance director explained that they were expanding operations into multiple states and needed someone who understood complex payroll compliance from the inside. "Our current system keeps running into reconciliation problems," he admitted during the call. "We need someone who has actually built solutions, not just managed software, for the first time in months." I felt something close to professional respect. 3 days later, they sent me an official offer. The salary alone was more than 20% higher than what I earned at Titan. The benefits were better, the role carried more authority, and the hiring manager made it clear they valued experience rather than treating it as something outdated. I sat at my desk staring at the offer letter for several minutes. Then, almost automatically, I opened my email and searched for the message Derek had sent to Human Resources 2 weeks earlier, the one that started all of this. "Start knowledge transfer immediately." I scrolled further down the thread until I found the line that had stayed in my mind since the meeting. "Honestly, your job isn't that hard." I read it once more. This time I smiled. Not because Derek was wrong, although he clearly was, but because his comment had accidentally helped me see the situation with complete clarity. If my job truly wasn't that hard, then leaving should not be a problem for the company. And if my work really was as replaceable as Derek believed, then Titan would function perfectly well without me. I closed the email window and opened a new document instead. 2 paragraphs, clear and professional. A formal resignation notice. After 12 years at Titan Industrial Contractors, I had finally made a decision that felt simple, rational, and overdue. I was leaving. If you think updating my resume, accepting a better offer, and choosing to resign after 12 years without a raise was the right move, leave a 1 in the comments. Your opinion truly matters. Because every voice in the conversation reminds people that respect and fair treatment at work should never be taken for granted. The following Monday morning, I walked into Titan Industrial Contractors with a quiet sense of rebellion I had never felt before. For 12 years I had followed every rule, solved every crisis, and kept payroll running without interruption. This time, I was doing something different. I was leaving. I printed my resignation letter before most people had arrived. The paper felt strangely light in my hands, considering how much of my life had been tied to this building. 12 years of deadlines, emergency fixes, and midnight payroll corrections were summarized into 2 calm paragraphs. I walked down the hallway to Derek Halverson's office and knocked. "Come in," he called. Derek barely looked up from his laptop when I stepped inside. I placed the letter on his desk and waited while he finished typing whatever email he was sending. Finally, he glanced at the paper. "What's this?" he asked. "My notice," I said evenly. Derek read the first few lines, then looked up again, clearly confused. "You're quitting," I nodded once. For a moment, he stared at me as if he expected me to smile and admit it was a joke. When that didn't happen, he leaned back in his chair and laughed. "Well," he said, still chuckling. "Good timing." He gestured vaguely toward the bullpen outside his office, where Evan was working. "Evan is almost ready anyway." There was no anger in his voice, no urgency, just the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the transition had already happened. I kept my tone neutral. "Great," Derek nodded approvingly, apparently satisfied that the situation was working out exactly the way he expected. "You've done a good job documenting everything," he added. "That training plan helped a lot." "Glad to hear it," I replied. He slid the letter aside and returned his attention to the laptop screen. "HR will handle the paperwork," Derek said. "Standard 2 weeks." "Of course." I left his office and walked back to my desk without saying another word. The rest of the day passed quietly. Evan asked a few routine questions about payroll reporting, and I answered them the same way I had for the past 2 weeks, calmly, clearly, and without offering anything Derek hadn't specifically requested in the training schedule. By the afternoon, my resignation had spread through the finance department. A few coworkers stopped by my desk. "Are you really leaving?" one of them asked. "Yes," I said. Most of them looked surprised. Some looked concerned. After all, payroll cycles at Titan had been running the same way for more than a decade. Stability had become something people simply expected. Evan seemed less sure how to react. Near the end of the day, he walked over, holding a printed payroll checklist. "So, you're actually leaving?" he asked. "That's the plan." He studied the checklist for a moment. "I think I understand most of this," he said cautiously. "I'm sure you do." That was the strange thing about the entire situation. Derek truly believed the transition had been completed. From his perspective, the system had been documented, the training had been delivered, and the replacement was already sitting at the desk. Everything looked orderly, predictable, controlled. For the rest of the week, I finished the remaining handover tasks exactly as expected. I organized the documentation files, confirmed the reporting templates, and answered Evan's final questions about the payroll workflow. No arguments, no complaints, just quiet cooperation. By Friday afternoon, my desk was nearly empty. I shut down my computer, placed my security badge in the drawer, and took one last look at the payroll dashboard glowing on the monitor. 12 years of work summarized into a few lines of system logs as I walked toward the elevator. I couldn't help noticing something Derek clearly hadn't thought about. My final day didn't fall at the end of a quiet payroll cycle. It fell exactly 2 days before the largest payroll run of the month, the one that processed checks for more than 3,000 construction workers across 5 states. And this time, the system would be running without the person who had quietly kept it stable for 12 years. My last day at Titan Industrial Contractors ended quietly. I handed in my badge, shook a few hands, and walked out of the building with the calm certainty that I had made the right decision. No dramatic farewell, no angry speeches, just 12 years of work closing behind me as the elevator doors slid shut. For the first time in a long while, the weekend felt unusually peaceful. On Sunday evening, I almost opened my laptop out of habit, the way I used to when preparing for the next payroll cycle. Then I remembered something important. Payroll was no longer my responsibility. 2 days later, early Tuesday morning, Titan began running the largest payroll cycle of the month. More than 3,000 construction workers across 5 states were scheduled to be paid. The process normally began early, so the accounting department could verify everything before bank transfers were finalized. From what I later heard, the first 20 minutes looked completely normal. Evan initiated the payroll run exactly the way I had shown him. The system processed employee hours, applied the standard rate tables, and began calculating overtime adjustments. Reports started populating across the dashboard, just like they always had. For a while, everything appeared smooth. Then the first warning message appeared. Union overtime mismatch. At first, Evan assumed it was a minor data problem, Payroll systems produce warnings occasionally, and most of them are resolved with small adjustments. He opened the diagnostic panel and attempted to validate the calculation rules. The system didn't respond the way he expected. Instead of clearing the warning, the system generated a new message in the log window. Payroll halted. Audit required. The processing engine stopped immediately. According to the system clock, the payroll run had been active for 21 minutes. Evan tried to run the validation sequence again. The same message appeared. The payroll engine refused to continue. At that point, Derek Halverson was called into the finance department. "What's going on?" he asked. Evan pointed at the screen. "There's some kind of overtime mismatch." Derek frowned. "Then fix it. I'm trying," Evan said. He opened the configuration tables and began comparing the union rule entries with the payroll data imported from the construction sites. After several minutes of scrolling through rows of numbers, he attempted to restart the payroll engine. The system rejected the command. Payroll locked audit in progress. Evan looked confused. "I think the system triggered a compliance lock." Derek crossed his arms. "Restart it." "That might not just restart it." Evan followed the instruction and initiated a full payroll restart. For a moment, the system appeared to reset. Then 3 new error messages appeared in rapid succession. Union differential conflict. Compliance review triggered. Audit escalation active. The dashboard froze. Now the payroll system wasn't just paused. It was locked behind a compliance audit sequence designed to prevent incorrect payments from being released. Derek's expression changed from annoyance to visible frustration. "What did you do?" he demanded. "I didn't do anything," Evan said quickly. "The system triggered it automatically." Derek stared at the screen as if the computer might suddenly explain itself. "How long does this take to clear?" Evan hesitated. "I'm not sure." "What do you mean you're not sure?" Derek snapped. I've never seen this error before." The room grew quiet as several members of the finance team gathered around the monitors. The payroll dashboard remained frozen, the audit message blinking steadily in the center of the screen. Someone in accounting checked the clock. If payroll didn't finish soon, the bank transfer window would start closing. Derek leaned closer to the monitor. "There has to be a way to override it," he said. Evan searched through the system menus, opening every configuration panel he could find. Nothing offered a solution. Finally, he sat back in his chair. "I don't see any way to clear the audit lock." The silence in the room deepened, because for the first time that morning, everyone realized something Derek had never considered. No one in that office actually knew how to fix the problem. 2 days after I left Titan Industrial Contractors, my phone began buzzing before I even finished my morning coffee. At first, I ignored it. Unknown numbers have a certain way of announcing trouble, and for the first time in 12 years, payroll trouble was no longer mine to solve. But by the third call, curiosity won. I didn't answer. Instead, I checked the message preview. It was from someone in the finance department. "Kelly, payroll is frozen. Something's wrong." For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. Then I set the phone down and let the silence of my kitchen return. Somewhere across the city, inside the Titan finance office, the situation was very different. By mid-morning, the payroll room had apparently turned into a pressure cooker. More than 3,200 construction workers were scheduled to receive their pay that week. Crews across 5 states had already submitted their hours. Supervisors had approved timesheets. The payroll cycle should have been moving toward bank transfers. Instead, the system had stopped, from what I later heard. The tension escalated quickly once the chief financial officer stepped into the room. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Looking at the frozen payroll dashboard, Derek Halverson stood beside Evan's workstation, arms folded in visible irritation. "Minor system issue," Derek said. The CFO looked at the screen. "Then why is payroll frozen?" No one answered immediately. Evan cleared his throat. "There's an overtime mismatch error that triggered an audit lock." The CFO frowned, and Evan hesitated. "I've never seen this error before." Around them, members of the finance team exchanged uneasy glances. Payroll systems were supposed to produce numbers, not mysteries. The blinking message on the screen told a different story. Payroll halted. Audit required, meanwhile. The outside world had already begun reacting. Union representatives had started calling. Construction supervisors were emailing the payroll department asking whether checks would arrive on time. Accounting staff were quietly calculating how long they had before the bank processing window closed. Inside the room, Derek's confidence began to fade. "Just clear the lock," he said. "I can't." Evan replied, "What do you mean you can't? I mean, there's no option to override it." Derek stared at the screen as if it were personally insulting him. "There has to be a fix." Evan searched through the system menus again, opening configuration panels and scrolling through rule tables. Nothing worked. The audit lock remained in place. That was the moment when the CFO's patience began to disappear. "Why wasn't this addressed during training?" he asked sharply. Evan looked uncomfortable. "I didn't know this situation existed." Derek suddenly turned away from the screen and looked around the room. "Where's Kelly?" he asked. The question hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Several people glanced at each other. No one answered. The CFO looked confused. "Kelly Bryant," Derek repeated impatiently. "The payroll analyst." Another silence. Finally, someone from accounting spoke quietly. "She doesn't work here anymore." Derek blinked. "What, she resigned last week?" The room felt suddenly smaller. Derek looked back at the frozen payroll dashboard, then at Evan, then back at the screen again. "You're telling me," he said slowly. "The only person who might know how to fix this left." No one replied. Outside the building, thousands of workers were waiting for their paychecks. Inside the finance department, the payroll system remained locked behind a compliance audit that no one seemed able to clear. Phones continued ringing. Emails continued arriving. Union representatives were asking questions the company could not answer. And standing in the middle of the room, Derek Halverson was finally confronting a possibility he had never seriously considered. The payroll system he called simple might actually depend on someone who was no longer there. Late that morning, as I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing onboarding documents from my new job, my phone rang again. The same Titan area code appeared on the screen. I had already ignored 3 calls from the company that morning. The fourth one felt almost predictable. For a moment, I simply watched the phone vibrate against the table. Then I answered. "Hello?" There was a brief pause on the other end before Derek Halverson spoke. "Kelly, we need your help." His voice sounded different than it had during our last meeting, less confident, less certain. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the moment uncomfortable. "I thought payroll was simple," I said calmly. Another pause followed. On the other end of the line, I could practically hear Derek grinding his teeth. "This is serious," he replied. "I assumed it might be." Derek exhaled sharply, clearly trying to keep his temper under control. "There's an audit lock on the payroll system," he said. "We've been trying to clear it for over an hour." I glanced at the clock on the wall. The payroll cycle would have started early that morning, if the system was still locked. The bank transfer schedule was already slipping. "That sounds inconvenient," I said. "It's more than inconvenient." Derek snapped. 3,000 workers are waiting for their paychecks. I didn't answer immediately. In the background, I could hear voices in Derek's office. People talking quickly, phones ringing, the low hum of a department under pressure. "So," Derek continued, forcing his tone to soften slightly, "we need you to walk Evan through the fix." I let out a quiet breath. "Well," I said slowly, "I'm not an employee anymore. That's obvious. Then I suppose we're talking about consulting." There was another pause. "What do you mean?" Derek asked. "I mean, I'm happy to help," I replied evenly. "But consulting services have a rate." The silence this time lasted longer. Finally, Derek asked, "What rate?" I leaned forward slightly and spoke clearly. $350 per hour. For several seconds, Derek didn't respond. When he did, his voice sounded tight. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" I said. Derek lowered his voice, probably stepping away from the other people in the room. Kelly, we don't have time for this. I understand that. Then help us fix the system. I just told you I can. At $350 an hour, he said, repeating the number as if it personally offended him. That's correct. Another wave of voices rose in the background, and I heard someone say something that made Derek curse under his breath. What now? He demanded. Apparently, the payroll room had just received another call. This time it wasn't accounting, it was the union, even without being there. I could imagine the conversation happening in real time. Construction unions rarely reacted calmly when payroll issues delayed checks. Their contracts included strict payment timelines and penalties for missed deadlines. Derek returned to the phone. The union is already calling, he said. They're asking why payroll hasn't processed. That sounds stressful. It is stressful. He hesitated before continuing. They're threatening to escalate if this isn't resolved today. I nodded to myself. That part made sense. If payroll delays continued, union representatives could file formal complaints or even encourage work stoppages. Construction projects across 5 states could grind to a halt within hours. So, I said quietly, do you still think payroll is simple? Derek didn't answer. For the first time since the call began, his voice lost the last trace of its earlier arrogance. Kelly, he said, are you coming in or not? I considered the question for a moment. The truth was that I already knew exactly what had happened inside the payroll system. The audit lock triggered when overtime rules conflicted with union differential tables. It was a problem I had solved several times over the years. But Derek didn't know that. And now, with union representatives already threatening escalation, time was quickly becoming the most expensive thing in the room. Yes, I said finally, I'll come in. But Derek, what he asked, my consulting rate still stands. When I returned to Titan Industrial Contractors that afternoon, the atmosphere inside the finance department felt completely different from the calm office I had left only a few days earlier. Conversations were rushed, phones were ringing constantly, and several people were gathered around the payroll monitors as if staring hard enough might force the system to fix itself. I walked in quietly, for a moment. No one noticed. Then someone from accounting looked up and said, Kelly's here. Every head in the room turned toward me at the same time. Derek Halverson stepped forward quickly. The confidence he had displayed during our last meeting was gone. In its place was the tight, strained expression of someone who had spent the morning watching a problem grow larger by the minute. Good, he said. We've been waiting. I nodded slightly, but didn't rush to the computers. Before we begin, I said calmly, I assume the consulting agreement has been approved. Derek didn't look pleased, but he gestured toward the chief financial officer standing near the main workstation. The CFO spoke first. You'll receive your consulting rate, he said. Let's focus on getting payroll running. That works for me. I stepped up to the payroll console and looked at the dashboard. The error message was exactly what I expected. Payroll halted, audit required. The audit log confirmed the issue almost immediately, a conflict between union overtime calculations and the differential pay table for night shift crews. When Evan had restarted the system earlier that morning, the conflict escalated into a compliance lock designed to prevent incorrect payments from being processed. Evan stood beside me, clearly relieved someone else was looking at the screen. I tried validating the rule tables. He said quickly, but the system kept triggering the audit again. That's normal, I replied. I opened the administrative console and typed a short command to access the reconciliation scripts running behind the main payroll engine. Several lines of diagnostic data appeared. Then I opened the override panel that allowed manual adjustment of the union rule conflict. From the corner of my eye, I could see the finance staff watching closely. The room had gone quiet. How long will this take? Someone asked. About 3 minutes? I said. First, I corrected the overtime conflict inside the differential pay table. Then, I ran the reconciliation script that verified the corrected calculations against the payroll totals. Once the script finished, I entered the final command to release the audit lock. The system paused for a moment, Then the payroll engine restarted. Rows of calculations began scrolling across the screen again. Over time, adjustments recalculated. Tax deductions updated. Union differential pay processed without error. Within seconds, the system resumed exactly where it had stopped earlier that morning. The payroll dashboard finally displayed the message everyone in the room had been waiting for. Payroll processing active. A collective breath seemed to release across the finance department. Evan stared at the screen. "That's it," he asked quietly. "That's it," I said. The CFO stepped closer. Reviewing the updated payroll totals. "All transfers will still process today?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "The delay won't affect the bank window." He nodded slowly, clearly relieved. Then he turned his attention toward Derek. For a few seconds, the two men simply stood there in silence. Finally, the CFO asked the question that had been building all morning. "How did we lose the only person who knew how this system actually works?" Derek didn't answer. He looked at the screen, then at the finance team, then briefly at me. But no explanation came. I stepped away from the console and gathered my laptop. The payroll system was stable again. The crisis that had thrown the department into chaos only hours earlier had disappeared with a few lines of code and the knowledge of where to apply them. But as I walked toward the exit, I could already sense something else shifting behind me. The CFO had begun asking questions. Questions about training. Questions about operational risk. Questions about how a system responsible for paying thousands of employees could suddenly become unmanageable the moment one person left. By the time I reached the elevator, the company's leadership had started discussing something Derek clearly hadn't expected: an internal review. By the end of that week, Titan's board of directors would open a formal investigation into how the payroll system had nearly collapsed and why no one except the former payroll analyst seemed to understand it. The weeks after the payroll incident unfolded with a strange sense of balance, as if the company itself was slowly correcting an equation that had been wrong for a long time. What had started as a simple system failure turned into something much larger. The internal review began almost immediately after the crisis. Titan's board of directors wanted answers. The payroll system was responsible for moving millions of dollars every month, and the idea that it could freeze because the wrong person had been pushed out of the company made several executives very uncomfortable. Over the next few days, investigators interviewed people from finance, accounting, and human resources. They reviewed training documents, internal emails, and the system logs from the failed payroll cycle. The conclusions came together quickly. First, it became clear that Derek Halverson had forced the transition without fully understanding the system he was replacing. The investigation showed that the payroll training period had been shortened to meet Derek's modernization timeline. Even though the system handled complex union contracts across multiple states. Second, the board learned that Derek had publicly announced my replacement before the training process was even complete. That decision created operational risk at the exact moment Titan needed stability the most. And finally, the most serious issue surfaced, because the payroll system had frozen for several hours. The company had come dangerously close to violating union payment deadlines. If the bank transfer window had closed before the system restarted, Titan could have faced penalties approaching $1.2 million, all because someone believed payroll was not that hard. The board's response came the following week. Derek Halverson was terminated. The official explanation used the language companies prefer operational negligence and leadership failure. But the message behind it was simple. The person responsible for the crisis was no longer working there. As for me, my relationship with Titan changed in a very different way. The company still needed someone who understood the payroll system deeply enough to prevent future failures, instead of hiring another full-time employee. The board approved a consulting agreement. Now I worked with Titan on my terms, not as the overlooked payroll analyst who quietly fixed problems behind the scenes, but as a consultant whose expertise carried a clear value. Several months later, while scrolling through LinkedIn one evening, I noticed something familiar. Derek Halverson's profile appeared in my feed. His job title had changed, Under his name was a simple line that said, "Open to new opportunities." I stared at the screen for a moment and then laughed softly. Because sometimes the people who say your job isn't that hard are the very same people who discover they can't do it themselves for even a single day. There's something strange about the moment when you realize your value was never the problem, only the people measuring it were. For 12 years, I believed loyalty would eventually speak for itself. I believed hard work, quiet fixes, and late nights keeping things running would be noticed. But the truth is, sometimes the systems we maintain run so smoothly that people forget who built them in the first place. That experience taught me something practical and deeply human at the same time. Respect in the workplace isn't just about effort, it's about recognizing when your effort is being taken for granted. Walking away wasn't revenge, it was clarity. And strangely, the moment I stopped trying to prove my worth inside that system was the moment everything finally made sense. I sometimes wonder what you would have done in the same situation. Would you have stayed longer, hoping things might change, or would you have stepped away the moment you realized your work was being dismissed? There isn't always a perfect answer, but there is always a moment when we choose whether to shrink or stand up for ourselves. By the way, I'm curious, where are you listening to this story from today, if this story meant something to you, even in a small way? Consider subscribing, leaving a comment, or sharing the video. One small action from you can help stories like this reach someone who might need to hear it right now. Sometimes a single story can change how someone sees their own situation, and you might be the reason they find it. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.